All right. Well, why don't we get started? I got just a minute after 7. My name is Jeff Pospisil. I'm the conference treasurer, and I'm here with Sheri Meister as my co-host. So,
hello, everyone. I'm Sheri Meister.
She has a double role nowadays. She's the director of both the Minnesota Conference and the just Minnesota Conference. I'm giving you even more power.
Oh, Jeff. Took over the Minnesota Conference and still with the Dakotas Foundation. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So you took over Minnesota as well. No, you're director over the Minnesota Foundation as well as the Dakotas Foundation. So, we are going to record this webinar and make it available for later. And one of the things too, we're going to send you an evaluation in the email probably tomorrow. I think is when it's going to go out. Just so that we can get feedback, and if you have ideas for future topics, we'd love to hear it. But the topic that we have today, and this is mainly in Sheri's wheelhouse, is a deep dive into endowments and legacy giving. We have a lot of churches. Well, it's just interesting how we're in that stage in most of our churches' lives where you got a lot of people that are in the fourth quarter of their lives. I don't know if that's the nice way to say it. And we just thought this is beneficial as there's going to be a gap in there where there's going to be a dip in giving, and this is one of those ways that maybe if people understood endowments and legacy giving, we can help bridge that gap before the next generation is able to start filling that. So,
as we begin tonight to talk about this, endowments can be a word that many people avoid, and they avoid talking about the issue within the churches, and then also about approaching others. So we're hoping that we can make it a little bit easier to discuss and kind of take the fear out of it. And so Jeff and I'll go back and forth through this. We usually have it a little bit more scheduled, but as we're going through the slides, but we will both be presenting part of it because we both see where these conversations and examples are in each one of the churches, and so we want to share those with you. Like I said, the endowment is kind of a scary word, or people are afraid of it, or they just don't understand it. But it's not as complicated as everyone perceives it to be. Let's see if I can get there we go. The legacy gift or a planned gift, which an endowment is included in, is a contribution that is arranged in the present and allocated at a future date. So it can be through a will and a trust, but you'll find out tonight that it can also be, an endowment can be set up when people are still alive and when people have an extra amount of wealth or resources that they are willing to trust with the church. They set it up as a bequest, and they just want to be very loyal and supportive of the church. So to do that, I think one of the things to recognize that there are places in your church and people who have wealth in your church or resources is to recognize spiritual gifts. And giving is one of the spiritual gifts. And some people feel maybe they can't do some of the other things in the church, and they don't know where to put their gifts, and giving is one of those. So time is one of them. And I want each one of you to think of somebody who gives a lot of time to your church. And I'm not real sure why this PowerPoint is going off by itself, but anyway, if you think of somebody who gives a lot of time to your church, and it can be in any areas of the church, if they're in worship or if they're in serving, if they are working for hospitality, any of those, think of the times, or people that give time. And then think of the people who have talent in your church. Who sings in the choir? That's usually the first one that comes to mind. People that have a gift of reading the scripture. People who have many, many different talents. It's real easy to ask them to use their talents within your church.
What about those that would have like the gift talent of like leadership or something like that?
Financial talent as far as knowing and understanding finances. Many times people put those on the finance committee. If you bring talent of someone who works in public relations, they oftentimes are seen on the staff parish relations committee. And there's many, many different talents that people have that you can incorporate into your leadership, into your administration, or into the regular Sunday morning worship service. So think of those people and think of how many times you've gone to one of those individuals and asked them to share their time or talent. And now think about somebody who maybe has resources. Who are the people that might have a little extra wealth that might be willing to share that wealth in your church? And this is where it becomes more difficult because many times people that have the wealth aren't necessarily sharing their time or their talent, so they might not be as engaged in the activities of the church. So how do you think of these people and how do you engage them in the church so that they feel that if they're not, if they can't sing in the choir and they don't feel comfortable teaching Sunday school anymore and they're not wanting to serve at the weddings and the funerals and they're not on any more committees, how do you engage them with what's going on in the church so that they feel comfortable and want to give their treasure?
So,
go ahead, Jeff.
I couldn't remember if this is my part or your part. Maybe this is you still.
This is still me.
Okay, sorry.
So, with the individual you're thinking about considering an endowment, has anyone ever discussed the possibility of them gifting a large amount of money to your church? And why would you ask them to do so? What would make you think that they would be a person that might want to give? And one of the things that we are finding that the church maybe falls a little bit short on is that they assume that the individual is going to give to the church or that they should give. And those of you who have heard my presentations before hear me say all the time that we can no longer just assume or that people should give to the church because there's so many other places, nonprofits that are being really, really good at asking people to give and to find out how those people are connected to their organizations. And that's what the church needs to do as well. All right, Jeff, this is you.
All right. And I want to talk specifically. I'm the one that's part of our foundation team that actually helps administer at least the calculation part of the endowment. So I get kind of excited this because, and I'm just going to read what it says here first. An endowment is a fund that holds its principal in perpetuity and pays out about 4 to 5% per year that goes to church programs. Okay. I was teaching at Mission U, which is our UMW thing, and one of our churches, they started talking about endowments and they said, "Oh, that's kind of like our farmland. That's almost a form of an endowment. If you want to get that in your mind, sometimes some of our churches they've received farmland in the past, and so they have this valuable asset. But the thing is, the asset just stays there, and it's just the income off that asset. It's that rent or that crop sharing income that the church ends up receiving." And that's probably the clearest way to think about an endowment is you have that asset and then you just, but then the church receives the income off of that. The nice thing about a regular endowment, where it's actually just money that goes into a fund that's invested, and then you receive 4 to 5% of the value of that over the time, and it's invested in a way to protect the principal. But the nice thing about an actual endowment is you don't have to be a landlord, which is nice. I guess I don't like being a landlord. I don't like having to make decisions when to sell, if you have to sell crops. I don't like any of that. So, and then the other nice thing is the documentation. It depends on how you manage it. If you get somebody that knows what they're doing to manage your endowment, and we'll talk about that later. But if you get somebody who knows how to manage your endowment, they write down what the donor wanted, because I don't know how many times, even this little church that shared with me, they said, we got the farmland. One of the people says that we can't sell the land no matter what. Somebody else says we could use the money for this. Somebody else says we could use the money for that. And I say, well, that's why you just need to have somebody, you need to have a manager on that. And that's one thing I like with traditional endowment, is that you can have somebody that keeps the actual records, and that's their job. So how we manage our endowments with the foundation is we want to actually grow your principal. So that's why we distribute 4 to 5%, because we want to grow the principal, because on average, we get about 6 to 7% return. So that means we're trying to grow it by about that 2 to 3% every year, which is basically just keeping up with inflation. And that way, we're also able to grow the distribution. So that little 4 to 5% grows over time. And we've been doing this forever. And if you think about it, let's just say you have somebody that has been given to your church for 80 years, and they pass. And now they're able to give for 80 plus years again. So, I mean, just because of how it's invested, and that amount will grow and grow, and actually they can keep giving to your church as long as your church exists. So, and we've even had people set up their endowment so that way, if they love their church, but if they know some of our small communities, they can see that maybe their church won't be around forever. They also then name some other ministry that they also really loved during their time. So we see a number of them that will say camping or the Builders Club or something like that.
Scholarship.
Yeah, scholarships, a lot of those. But it's just a great way for the donor to give. And this is a horrible thing. I told somebody, wouldn't it be the best if your largest giver didn't even have to be alive? So, and that was after I stopped being allowed to talk to donors. Yeah, we don't let them do that any longer. I know, but it was just that idea where a number of our people are so faithful at giving, and we think, what are we ever going to do when so and so goes, passes on? But they can still support the ministry of the church if they want to live a legacy gift in the form of an endowment or a trust. So, one of the things I see a lot of is that churches, well, let's say it this way, a personal pass, and they'll just say, we'll give $50,000 to the church, or we'll give $100,000 to the church, or a percentage of our estate. We'll give 10% of our estate to the church. And it goes into this kind of reserve fund. And a lot of the churches, what they've done, I don't know about a lot, but a number of churches, what I've seen is they'll put that in CDs, and then they'll slowly spend down that CD. And I just think about that. It was kind of one of those short-sighted things usually. We've seen a number of churches where because they can spend it down faster than they normally would, they do, and then the giving slows down. It's interesting because they feel like they're excused to not give to support the church because they have this reserve fund that they could spend without any discipline. So an endowment kind of locks it into the donor's wishes. That's a nice thing. I mean, it's designed to protect that principle. Somebody gives $100,000, and 10 years from now, actually, we're going to grow that. It's going to be $120,000 or something like that. And the distributions are going to still be there. If somebody puts it into a CD/reserve fund, especially when CD rates were so low there back in around 2009, 2010, all the way for almost a decade or so when it was less than 1%, a lot of churches spent down their CDs, and we're seeing some of them closing now. I know of one that's just closing this year because that's exactly what happened. So
I think the other thing to remember is that with endowments, you can add to them. Some of the questions we get often are, once the endowment's set up, it's just going to stay that. So if somebody gives $100,000, then it's always going to be, the principal's always going to be $100,000. And you can always add to that endowment as long as the dollars that you're adding to stay true to the intent of the endowment, and the distribution then goes as the initial paperwork said and the initial agreement was. So I think that's one of the things that people get kind of locked in, is that once you have an endowment, you can't add to it. You can't take away from the principal, but you can always add to the principal.
You know, that's a good example, because we have some families that give regularly to their family endowment, you know, and then whenever there's a death in the family, they give a memorial gift. The other thing we've seen churches starting to do is they'll give a percentage of their income. So they'll give 2 or 3% of their income to the endowment, knowing that it's going to build up over time. And that's been kind of fun to watch, especially for those things like capital repairs. I mean, we have one church that has endowment for over $100,000, so they get about $4,000 to $5,000 every year, and that's growing. So it's about $5,000 now. But imagine if you got a $5,000 gift to start up every capital project every single year. I mean, that's a nice gift.
Right.
All right. Is this you?
Go ahead.
Okay. Who should manage the funds? You know, I'm going to tell you, I'm biased. I like it if the foundation or somebody like that at least manages it, where they are going to try to respect the donor's intent. They're going to be disciplined about it. They're going to have people that are going to manage investments well. I think we have some churches that set up endowment committees to manage it, and I think some of them do fine. But I want to say more often than not, and I've even had this at the conference level too. More often than not, what happens is there's a turnover in leadership and it gets forgotten. So we've had 2 churches here, I think within the last 12 months, that remembered that they had investment accounts set up, and but they forgot they were trying to manage them like endowments. And anyway, it was just sad because they were struggling financially until all of a sudden they remembered that they had this money set aside for them already. So that's why I like a foundation, is you just say, send us a check, and we'll send you a check, and it'll tell what the name of the endowment. So it might say the Pospisil Family Endowment, and it'll say exactly what the restrictions are. And that way nobody has to remember that. I mean, all you have to do is, read it and try to spend it accordingly.
I think that's the other point to that, Jeff, is that what we see when churches and organizations within the United Methodist Church, when they have an endowment and they have their own managers managing it, or they have an outside source managing it, and they have an investment committee, the focus becomes on the returns rather than on the ministry that's happening. And if we're managing it, we can help with that, helping people understand that it's managed to the best abilities of our manager, and then we help the churches figure out how to spend their earnings on ministry rather than focusing on every single individual stock manager. We can help our churches focus more on the ministry of the church.
Yeah. Hey, Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, you don't have to worry about that. We have a couple of churches trying to manage their own Edward Jones accounts, and again, it's all fine until the person who sets it up and knows what they're doing moves on one way or another. And that's the hard part, because it does take energy and a commitment to be able to manage the funds. And anyway, the funds invested with the foundation does earn a fee off of it, but again, our net return is 6 to 7%. That's our average return. So I mean, that's not bad at all when you compare it to other places. So, yeah. And so the one question we have is, what do you do? So sometimes you get these large unrestricted bequests, and sometimes we just like that because it gives us a little cushion in our account. I've had a number of churches get them, and they just kind of bail them out, which is, I'm not saying that's a bad deal, but we've had like a couple of them. What they've done is they've decided, okay, what are our immediate needs? And let's put aside some of that and spend it for that. And then the other part is, okay, now let's make this a church endowment. Let's make this a seed endowment for either capital or ministry of what's important, whatever the family would like. So we've had we've had one large one that was received that, yeah, they took care of some maintenance issues, and then they said, okay, the rest is going to go into an endowment to take care of the buildings forever. So that way they always get a large, I want to say it's about $20,000 every year to help with any of their maintenance needs. So, which is huge.
Right.
All right. If you have a restricted fund, how will restrictions, if any, be documented? Again, if you're managing it yourself, hopefully you have what I should tell churches, if you're managing it yourself, any reports you put out should have the restrictions on the bottom. That's what my practice is. It's just a good way to remind them. Again, if you're with the Dakota's United Methodist Foundation or Minnesota United Methodist Foundation, you're going to get a letter every year that spells out exactly what the restriction was, exactly what the donor said it was. So, yeah. So that's the best way. I mean, you just got to be clear on that. Who in the church decides how distributions are spent? And that's a good question. Sometimes you get these little pockets, somebody, and sometimes it's just, so-and-so knew the family or whatever it happens to be. But really it should be the church board should be, whatever that is, the admin council or the leadership team or whatever you call it, they should be either making that decision, looking at the total mission of the church, or at least they should be delegating it purposely. But sometimes that stuff gets to be somebody's pet project money. And it's because they have some kind of connection either with the family or whatever else, but they didn't give it to so-and-so, they gave it to the church. That's part of what you want to think about still with these gifts, is they should be furthering the mission of the church. And the other thing I'd say, the other question we have, will having an endowment make it more challenging will it prevent people from wanting to give? And a lot of times what we tell people, give it towards something that would normally be hard to fundraise for, or might not. I would normally say give it towards salaries or unrestricted, but I would say give it towards capital things, capital projects. I always, those can sometimes be a pain to always fundraise for. Give it towards ministry. I mean, no matter what, even if you have like camping scholarships, or you have Christian ed in your budget, they could always use more money. I mean, some of those ones, it's not bad that they have more money either. So it just allows them a little bit more cushion to dream a little bit bigger. But so will it? It could possibly. I want to say an unrestricted CD is more damaging for giving than a restricted endowment. So.
And this brings us to the gift acceptance policy. And these are very important for your church so that you have an idea and your church council has set up with your leadership of what you will accept and what you won't accept, because you want it to fit within the mission of your church. And the reason this is so important is that then if somebody with a pet project comes forward and says, I'll give you $100,000 if you do this. If you have a gift acceptance policy, it's okay to say no. And that's probably one of the toughest things you have to do. But you don't want these dollars that come in to sit there and then handcuff your church and the ministries of your church for eternity, because an endowment is set up forever. So these are the best reasons to give. Okay, my screen is working. To adopt a gift acceptance policy. Yeah, it might, if you get a gift that runs counter to your mission and your values, then you want to say no to that. And you do not want, you just don't want those type of things to run your church. And we've seen it happen. We've seen people say, you know, especially if you're doing new things and someone doesn't exactly love the direction that it's going, they'll try to use their dollars to steer that in another direction. And so a gift acceptance policy can help you underscore that and help you guide you to be able to either work with the donor. You can work with the donor to have them lift some of those restrictions, or just say no to the gift.
You know, a good example right now is, you know, some people are struggling with whether or not to keep the organ going or not, you know, and some of them know they need to go away from organ music because they don't have somebody that can play it well, you know, and it's getting harder and harder to find an organ player. But somebody could say, well, I'm going to make sure we always have an organ in this church, no matter what, no matter who likes it, because I'm going to give a gift of $100,000 to support, always maintain the organ or pay the organist or whatever it happens to be. But that's one of those examples where somebody could try to, oh, they want to go contemporary? I don't think so.
You know, we had that one time gift that was to a church, and it was for $50,000, and it could not go to the new organ, which was electric piano, or to the new building, which is 25 years old. So there's ministries in there that we could work with, but those stipulations were on that gift.
Yeah, and that was actually better because it wasn't saying you only had to give it to the old organ. It's just you couldn't give it to the new organ.
The new organ.
You still had a lot of room to play with that.
Right. So. The new building was a little tougher to get around because they weren't going anywhere in that. They wanted to stay in that new building that's 25 years old.
Yeah.
And then you have to make sure that the gifts are not leading to any legal obligations. And, you know, real property, you know, how much of the property tax, motor vehicles, somebody might want to dump a car because they haven't been able to sell it, so they'll dump it to you, or the tax implications and the resale of that car worth the amount of that car. And then boats. Boats seem to be the biggest item that maybe causes a little heartache. And this doesn't just happen in the church, this happens in nonprofits as well. Because for some reason, people think their boats are worth more than they are. So they're always disappointed if you decide to sell the boat and it doesn't come in at the amount that they thought it should to be able to build that.
And back to kind of legacy giving, I mean, the one I see sometimes is the reversion clause. So meaning that if, a lot of times it was with land, you know, the farmland or something like that, but sometimes it's with other gifts. If we had one church where if the church ever changed their name, the money, there was a legal obligation to disperse it among all the other United Methodist churches. So again, that would be one where you'd think, I think we should rethink that one. So,
Right.
but yeah, sometimes they'll put these clauses in there that will legally obligate a church to either lose the money or to do something they don't want to do. So.
Right. And then if there is a gift that is given to your church and they're just not equipped to use it, then you want to say no to those too. Outdated computers. You don't want the church to become the dumping ground for people just trying to get rid of their stuff. Pianos is another good example. Everybody that wants to get rid of their piano thinks the church wants it. And I can't remember which church it is, but one church has 7 pianos because people were donating them. And the whole community must have donated their piano to this church, but they had 7 pianos, and they weren't even using pianos anymore. They were basically using recorded music for their children's music, and then they were using the piano, well, not all 7 of them, in worship either.
Every Sunday school room had to have one. And but that was how Bismarck first was. We had, I want to say, at least a dozen pianos, and I don't think all of them even worked well. So, but again, if you don't want a piano, the church will want it. They can't say no.
Right, and TVs, they're good at just bringing a TV, but a gift acceptance policy can let you tell the person that you don't want that TV from 1962 and those type of things. So that's one of the biggest advantage of a gift acceptance policy is that it gives you the opportunity to say no. The other thing it does, a gift acceptance policy will build the credibility of your church and your administrative board because it shows that you are following best practices and that you are working and relating with your donors and you're managing your church better as well. Some more questions to consider. Is this opportunity giving your members a chance to connect with others? And this is on the whole picture of endowment. One thing that works really well is if you want to start an endowment, to do it, as Jeff mentioned earlier, as a fundraiser. To be able to do that, to have people connect, is if you knew 4 or 5 people that would give $10,000 to start, then you don't have to make all these asks as a church leader. The people with the wealth will help build with other people with the wealth. There are many people that would be willing to give $10,000, talk to their friends, and to help build that endowment so that you can, if you wanted to do $100,000 and you have 5 people that are willing to give 10, you've got $50,000. You're halfway there for your seed money before you even start your campaign. So you want to have this be an opportunity to connect with others. The other thing that's really important is that if you are building this and you have plans for this endowment and you're putting money back into that, to make sure that you bring your donors to see the ministry, tell your story, show your story, and show where their dollars are being used and are being used in the way of ministry. And then you have to believe in your mission for your ministry. The administrative board or the council and the leadership of the church have all got to get behind it. And that energy will then bring lots more energy from the donors and the people who want to give, and they will be excited about it as well. Jeff, I don't think there we go. Do they trust the leadership of the church? Has there been a history of great things going on in the ministries that have been spearheaded by this leadership, and are the things you're doing reaching into the community, inviting more families and children, whatever your mission is, do you have proof of that? Do you have examples to show that you are doing the things that you set out to do with some of the dollars, so that you build that trust within the leadership of or trust from the congregation to the leadership of the church? And do you have the pieces in place? Are you able to show them where it will be invested? Are you able to show it where it will be spent? Are you able to show people what your earnings are and what you plan to do with those earnings and a percentage of the earnings? And donors want to know that. They want to know that if they give $10,000, that it's going to be in the best place possible, and that the earnings of that will be spent. We often see in an endowment that people are excited because they built up a $100,000 endowment, so they can talk about their $100,000 endowment. They don't talk about the ministries. And because people don't see what's happening with those dollars sitting in the endowment or in the trust, then they lose trust in the program because the dollars aren't being spent. And so it's just sitting there. Never leave the dollars just sitting there waiting for the rainy day. Always find a ministry that you can apply the dollars to.
And that's kind of what I hope, when we send out our checks and our letters in January, is that people, they get used to it. Every January, right around the end of January, they get a check and it says the family's name, and there might be a little bit of word about the family as well as what it is. It becomes a trusted thing for them. Then they can easily, and because it of how clockwork that works, it's easy then to say, you know what, I'd like to be remembered like the whatever family is. It is something that's powerful. It gives people a good example then of what they could do with their resources. Where if your church has a history of receiving a gift and then spending it down to nothing, if you were financially savvy or whatever else, you would probably wouldn't give it that way. You would probably try to give it through another organization. So.
Right, and Jeff, that's a good point, is to bring up those situations every year when the letter comes back to you to say that you have this amount to spend in a certain area of ministry, to make sure that if the kids are going to camp, that they understand that it was a church endowment that helped those kids go to camp, or if it was a scholarship for a seminary scholarship or a Christian life scholarship or somebody going into religious studies, make sure that those dollars or that those situations are brought to the congregation so that they understand that. That will help people become more confident and want to give as well. Yeah. And then is there a tax benefit for the donor? Always make sure that and we'll talk about this a little bit, but make sure that you talk to a professional on this so that the tax benefits are the ones that the donor meets those requirements for that, and those are changing all the time. So it takes a really savvy tax professional to keep up with that. And so we don't give out that information, but we do direct you to either your financial advisor or your accountant to be able to identify which is the best route to be able to gift those dollars.
Yeah, probably one of the biggest mistakes is probably if people ever have like stocks or assets that they sell and then give the money afterwards, because then you have to claim all the capital gains taxes on that. Right. So you might as well just give it, and then you get the credit for the full value of the gift, but you don't have to claim all that income. So that's one of the ones that's probably the worst one. So. Right.
Especially if it's been land that's been in the family for a couple generations, then it's really the best to do it then that way, because then the nonprofit can absorb the capital gains because they're not charged in the same way that an individual is if they have it themselves.
Yeah.
And then always, always, always say thank you. Whatever form it takes. And this kind of goes in which is the size of the gift. A generic thank you, of course, would go out if you received 20 $10 gifts. You'd send out a generic thank you with maybe a note on it. And a personalized thank you letter then would go out if you were receiving larger gifts, and it goes on down the line. Personal handwritten notes, those are very, very important for large gifts, or if you know somebody that has really stretched themselves to give a gift of whatever value, and that they've talked to you about how important this ministry is to them and that they're giving all they can, then write them a personal handwritten note. If they've even inquired about the possibilities of them giving a gift, write them a personal note before you get the gift, and then of course one following up as well. But to show them that you're interested and that their contact to you was that important. Go ahead.
I was just thinking another thing that we've had the practice of doing is notifying the family that their gift was made from their endowment to support such and such ministry. So, for example, if the Miller United Methodist Church received an endowment distribution of X amount, we'll just let them know, hey, by the way, your family's endowment was sent off for X amount of dollars, and thank you for, and that's just another little quick way to recognize it and encourage them and thank them at the same time. So.
Mm-hmm. And then recognition, and Jeff, let's go back to that one just a second.
Sorry.
No, the recognition in worship, this really depends on the donor. We've had donors that thought that might be kind of nice. And we have donors that we work with within the churches that want to be totally anonymous. We have donors that donate to the foundation and to the conference that want to be totally anonymous. And so you want to you want to also follow that so that they are comfortable in the way that you thank them. Of course, all of us are familiar with naming rights on a project, and if the projects get to be to a large size, you might want to consider that. And then if you run an annual report, or if you give a state of the church report, you might want to mention each one of those also in your report, and so that these people get thanked at the appropriate level that they'd like to be thanked. Go ahead, Jeff.
All right. So estate planning, I mean, the neatest thing about estate planning, a lot of times people don't think ahead. They just assume their family will know what their wishes are, that some things will take care of itself. But it seems like a lot of times people have more assets than you'd think, and they could be a huge benefit or burden. I mean, we've seen a lot of times where that's caused troubles. But I think estate planning is one of the best ways to start communicating ahead of time. This is how I want at least my financial legacy to be. You know, but it is a struggle to get people to talk about that and acknowledge it. One of the most creative ways I've seen this done and approached is Watertown First was one where they said, well, we're going to do a practical stewardship series. So that it wasn't about, a normal stewardship series is trying to get you to understand how giving can help your faith. This one was talking about, okay, how do we deal with debt? How do we deal with budgeting? And then one of them was legacy giving. So the sermon was on legacy giving. And then afterwards, they invited somebody from the community that would be able to say, okay, I'm going to explain more of the detailed process. And if you want to make an appointment with me, then we can go ahead and work on your estate plan. But that was one of the best ways I saw of bridging that gap and helping people. really do what they're convicted to do. They love the church, like Sheri said early in the beginning. They've given their time, talent, and treasures to the church, and I think they want also to continue helping it even after they've passed. So, yeah.
And then
I guess I can't stress enough, one of the things the foundation is great about, but you can also find other professionals too, but getting a professional involved, especially with some of these gifts can be tough. I mean, I remember the foundation has helped a couple larger gifts where there was land and there were stocks and bonds, and they wanted to set up a charitable remainder trust, which would end up being a different form of an endowment. But with a trust like that, the person is able to give it during their lifetime, earn an income off it till they pass, and then the distributions, instead of going to them, start going to the church or the ministry. So, and a lot of those ones, they're a little bit trickier. You can't just Google it or look at YouTube and figure out this is how I do a charitable remainder trust. You can try it, but good luck. So that's where we like having somebody, a tax professional or a lawyer that's comfortable with this, to help guide that process, and just even to look it over to make sure we didn't do anything that we didn't intend to do. So.
Yes, this is not the place to go to legalforms.com.
Yeah.
And do a generic one.
I want to say, I didn't say this ahead of time, but going back to that back when estate planning, that's also the time to make it clear with those people that are going to be affected. So if for example, we had one donor come to us and said, I want to give a gift, and if the church ever does a building project, I want it to go to that. But if they don't do a building project, I don't want it to go to any of those exotic churches, and we're like, what is that? Is that Lutheran or what? But anyway, we got it clear and we got it nailed down. He says, okay, if my church doesn't do a building project and they happen to close, I want it to go to this church that I also liked. And if that church isn't around, I want it to go to the Builders Club ministry. And then if none of those are around, just do what you think is best. But I mean, it was the time, and even Sheri did that one where they didn't want it to go to the electric organ. If you don't communicate that ahead of time and you just write it down, then you're springing it on people and they don't know what you really meant. And it's a good way to talk it over with leadership and with family. So, all right.
Well, thanks, everybody. As always, do not hesitate to call our office. Either Jeff or I or anyone in our office can help you, and we'll get the information to you. If you would like us to come out and talk about endowments to your committee, your finance committee, your leadership, we can do that. Sometimes it's a little easier for us to bring up some of these conversations than it is when you're directly connected to it. So we're glad to help in any way we can. But again, remember, we're here to help you, and we want to make sure that you have the resources and the tools to be able to continue to do ministry within your churches.